who once again got published in Latino Rebels, a pretty impressive online news source. The last article about the psychology of immigration. And of course, always, this is a live show. We welcome you to write comments, and Dr. Patino can see your comments as we're doing the show and can respond. And of course, like, subscribe, and share. But today, we're going to be talking about something that some of us are very familiar with because maybe we were one, and that's rebellious adolescence.
Yes, I mean, thank you very much for the congratulations. I think that this publishing with Latino Rebels has become a routine, a periodic routine, which I really like, where we can explore a little more of the interface between psychology, psychiatry, and politics to some degree, sociological impact of psychological and psychiatric processes. Now, we're going to talk a little bit today about defiance and rebellion among adolescents. And again, this is a topic that has attracted a lot of attention, especially during COVID, right?
Mm.
Because what happened during COVID is that we got to see the best and the worst of us, because we got put in boxes, right? And there's some kids who just don't do well in boxes, and we'll talk about them. But also, it is natural for adolescents to have some degree of rebellion and defiance. And the reason is the purpose of adolescence. There's a biological, sociological, cultural, psychological process known as adolescence that serves a purpose. And the purpose is not complicated. The purpose is really to help someone separate. As simple as that, and we can get into a lot of detail about that. But in general, the issues that have to do with um, separation are going to make the adolescent defy, right? So the first step of separation from an adolescent is to create his or her own identity, right? In terms of, I am separate from my parents, and to identify that separation by identifying with themselves and with their closest group. Hence, friends become more important to adolescents than parents, right? So, why am I saying all of these things? Because we have to be able to identify what is average, acceptable, adaptive defiance.
Because
Now,
it is a healthy part of development.
exactly, exactly. At the end of the day, when kids complete the phase of adolescence, we hope that they have been given the necessary tools so they can manage their adult life in a non-destructive, adaptive way, meaning that they can be average, balanced human beings, right? And that's defined differently depending on what culture you're with and what environment you're in. Uh, but I think it's also important to understand that we tend to identify defiance, okay, quite obviously when somebody becomes an adolescent, but we forget that whatever happens in adolescence is determined by what we did during the previous 12 or 13 years.
Mm. Now, I've heard you say before, and I'm just going to reiterate
Sure.
this because I think it's a good point, that basically you raise your children from 0 to 12, and
Mhm.
then from 12 on, and you told me 12 to 19 is essentially adolescence. You contain them or you manage them. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, what happens is that in order for us to have a healthy, defiant adolescent, if you may, it sounds kind of like contradictory, but there's such a thing as an well-adapted defiance in an adolescent. We have to have done a lot of work before that, right? Now, if you remember, you may not remember when you were 2 years old, but there's basically two major episodes of defiance during the development of a child. One is age two. We tend to call it the terrible
Terrible
twos, right?
twos.
They will defy everything, right? And it's also adaptive for them because they're basically forcing you to develop the boundaries for them, right? And then you have the second large severe episode of defiance that happens in adolescence, right? So we have to do a lot of work from the time the baby's born to the time the adolescent reach puberty, or what we call adolescence, by providing them with the guidance and the rules. And the rules are really the values, right? And values have to come in psychological and in social terms. There, we all have values that come to ourselves individually and as a group, right? What is acceptable and what is not. But it's not as much the teaching of the values, but the process and how we do it, right? Now, there is a component of defiance that has to do with temperament, and we've talked about that before, meaning every child has their own little way of being from the time they're born. And we have to be able as parents to recognize the temperament. Some of them are fussy, some of them are angry all the time, some of them are just logs and they don't move on. There's some that cry a lot because they want to be fed. The ones that never cry, you have to wake them up to feed them. Each temperament is different. That temperament is the clay that the baby is born with. That's a biological clay. The experience, both personally, attachment, psychological, and social environment, is going to mold that temperament in certain ways. Now, there are certain kids that come with extra hot temperaments that are the result of bad connections in the brain, right?
Mm.
So in those particular cases, we have kids that have significant anxiety issues, attention deficit disorder, some kids with autistic behaviors, kids are exposed to drugs in utero, right? Like in particular, cocaine and amphetamines. There was a big epidemic back in the 90s with that. We saw a lot of kids being born with significant behavioral deficits, right? We have to be able to identify those deficits early so we can intervene early and provide those kids who are vulnerable a better chance.
Now,
Once, go
now
ahead.
is that I'm sorry, is that damage irreparable, or can it be fixed? Because you say it's actually physiological, right? It's a biological issue.
Well, what happens is that you have to think of the brain as a big mass of fat with a bunch of wires in it. The beauty of the brain is that those wires and those connections between different areas of the brain and the big ball of fat, right, is genetically determined, but psychologically and socially influenced.
Hmm.
So experience, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, how we relate, how we attach, it has an impact on how those connections are built. So if you think about it, the brain of a newborn has a lot more size in relation to the body. It's a very large brain, right? And actually gets pruned as the kid is growing, so it gets specialized, right? So you can say that the child is born with a lot more brain cells that they need, and it gets specialized as you learn to walk, as you learn to talk, as you learn to listen, so the evolution of the brain is going to be dependent on the experience you have, and that process of pruning lasts until about age 25, right? So that's when we can say that the brain has reached maturity of development, which kind of goes hand in hand with the development of personality, which is kind of interesting. Now, when you get to be 12, 13 years old, right, what happens is you hope that you give that child all the necessary tools to go to the face of defiance by respecting the rules and values of others, okay, to not abuse themselves and to be able to recognize when they're taking unnecessary risks. So that is a difficult situation for a lot of parents because adolescence requires risk taking.
Mm.
It requires that you take some steps that may put you in a difficult situation and then deal with the consequences, right? So the kids go out, take a risk, okay? They face consequences and come back, right? So what you hope is that, but while they're doing that, they're learning something. It's all a learning process, right? So remember we talked about the process starting when the child is born, not when the child reaches adolescence. You hope that you've done all everything possible for that kid to have a good foundation for the rest of their lives. If you're hoping to teach values to a child when they reach puberty, it's not that it's not possible, it's very difficult and it's terribly frustrating. Okay. Now, let me take it to another extreme. I work in the hospital. I treat adolescents age 12 to 17 every day. Right? My team has more than 50 kids in the hospital every day. We manage a lot of dysfunction, of the extreme dysfunction, danger to self, danger to others, acute psychosis, violence toward others, things like that. And invariably, what I find is that either by biological reasons or psychological reasons or social reasons, these kids missed a lot of the developmental structure required for them to recognize and to self-regulate, right? Self-regulation becomes important.
And what that's that prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that does not develop fully until 25. Is that correct?
It's actually the whole brain, but particularly the frontal cortex because it's the most advanced, mature problem solving part of the brain, right? A lot of the other areas have more to do with hearing and with walking and talking and other involuntary movement regulation and so on. But the frontal part of the brain is what makes us different than any other mammal. It
Mhm.
is that ability to problem solve, right? And to collect information and come up with a solution that makes us different. So that's why we call the frontal part of the brain like the brakes of the brain. If the brain was a car, the frontal lobes will be the brakes. And what you hope for is that you get input, either visual, auditory, tactile, emotional, whatever input is coming, and you process it in the frontal lobes before you start making decisions, right?
Mm,
So you don't act impulsively. So sometimes we talk about kids with attention deficit disorder as having no brakes.
mm.
They go from a stimulus to response without that middle ground, right? So we want the kids to have as much of that middle split second decision making, interpretation, and judgment so they don't get hurt too much. Okay, because when we say containment, it's not just containment in the context of wanting to control, it's containment in the context of protection.
It's interesting you said that. I have always said to people, and we hear the term bantied around of a safety net. And I tell people, having been a coach and watching my wife raise her kids, that you don't want to use the safety net like a hammock. That's not the point. The point is for a true safety net. Let them climb as high as they can. It's something to protect them as they come down. It's a control mechanism for the potential, ramifications of their behavior. But the question I have for you, and again, as you know, I grew up in a kind of an interesting uh, situation, especially through high school. I had some very high end, wealthy kids around me, and I went to boarding school. And there were some of us, like myself, who, yeah, we pushed, the rules a little bit. We were never malicious, never malevolent. It was always about a certain amount of enjoyment. But there were some kids that truly seemed to do it almost simply for, not the fun of it, but that the fact that it's disruptive. When does the defiance, when does the testing become maladaptive?
That's a very interesting question. It becomes maladaptive when society tells you that has become maladaptive. Basically, when you start getting in trouble. So it's not about just taking risks and confronting consequences. Is what is that doing to yourself as a child, right? So if you get arrested too many times because you're walking into a Circle K and running away with a six pack of beer and you're 17 years old, well, those are serious consequences, right? So what we're trying to say with the containment is that the maladaptiveness is not defined by us psychiatrists, it's defined by society. That's why we talk about values and rules, right? And the values and rules are not very complicated. You respect others' rights, you respect yourself, You can be caring and loving and kind and compassionate with yourself as you are with other people, right? It's basically what we have learned over generations and generations and centuries. What are the good values of a human being, right? We want the kids to be able to use them, right? Now, here's when it gets complicated and it gets extremely maladaptive and is more defined by the parents. And it has to do with the fact that parents react a lot, right? So that creates a lot of dysfunction because the kid is pushing you away. You don't know what they're doing. You don't know what kind of risks they're taking. You know, they're spending too much time in the room and you start getting anxious because you don't know, right? And you start imposing the restraints too tight to the point that the kid is going to react and then you're going to react as a parent, right? The problem with that is that you lose the communication. We have to understand as parents, it doesn't matter if your kid is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. The kid will always come back to you because the kids can abuse their parents in a way that they can abuse anybody else.
I have witnessed that firsthand.
Exactly. So we better recognize, okay, that we cannot change our kid's temperament. If your child has attention deficit disorder, or has autism, or has severe anxiety, right? You cannot change that. It doesn't matter how angry you get. You have to maintain that communication with your child so the child feels comfortable coming back to you when they have a problem, okay, whether it's a biological, a psychological, or a social problem, right? Because they're going to come back to you either way, either directly or indirectly, right? So having accepted the role as a parent when you decide to have children, most people decide to have children, some people don't, but they have them anyway, right? Implies a lot of responsibility. But we also have to understand that that responsibility is temporary because our kids are borrowed, right? We don't own them. And how they do in life is not a direct reflection of our value as persons. Okay. So I've said this before, we have to be accepting of our kids, but we don't have to like them. We don't have to stop loving them though. But it's okay for you to tell your child as a parent, you know, I love you very much, but right now I don't like you. And that's got to be okay. I don't have to feel guilty because I don't like you. And you shouldn't feel upset because I don't like you, because that's reciprocal. I can tell you that a lot of the teenage kids out there who don't have any psychiatric problems, right, love their parents very much, but very often they don't like them,
Hear that a lot. Absolutely.
right?
So, how does the archetypal helicopter parent affect this dynamic? Because if they're not allowing the kid to take any risks and
Mhm.
they're all over it and basically doing everything for them, how does it affect this development?
Well, we have two aspects to that, and that is very much seen in modern societies, especially in urban societies, in that we forgot that, and I don't want to get much into politics, and it takes a village, right? And that concept of takes a village is important, not in the political sense, in the sense that if we want our kids to learn our values, we have to include them as part of the village very early in life, right? What happens is that we have turned our kids into objects that are fragile. That's our idea, right? And they're so fragile that we don't want to make any mistake because then they're going to end up being hurt, right? But by taking that attitude, we're hurting the kids,
Mm.
right? And I've said this before. I go back to earlier societies, and you can still go down to Central America and South Central Mexico, and you're going to see a lot of the native population there not having to deal with the kids having tantrums, right? And you tell them about tantrums and say, why?
Yeah, why do those exist? Why
Why,
would anybody do that?
why do I have to argue with a kid so they can wash the dishes, right? So what happens is that kids very early in those societies are assigned tasks very early, probably starting at 2 or 3 years old,
Hmm.
right? So when the kid gets to be 9, right? You don't have to ask the kid to wash the dishes. The family has dinner, and whoever is turned to do the dishes does the dishes. Goes to feed the cow. I mean, what we do here is that we want our kids to be given, right? And instead of the kids learning that they're part of.
Mm.
So you can still see it in the United States, in certain areas of the United States, especially in rural areas, that kids start working very early, right? They become part of the process of earning, right? I mean, our society, I mean, why kids don't go to school in the summer is based on that, right?
Mm.
It's based on the old days when they needed the kids in the farms during the summer. So they'll go to school during the non-farming time of the year, right? And so everything has evolved over that. And we have to be able to take it back to a point where kids learn, right? From being part of the clan, being part of the process, and to learn to socialize and feel comfortable taking risks outside of the clan once they feel that they can participate in other activities, right? Because they're going to be driven by biological and psychological developmental issues. Now, I was listening to a podcast this morning, because I listen to podcasts sometime. And it was a very interesting commentary from a person out of Argentina, and he was talking, and actually not Argentina, no, from Chile, and I found his comments really fascinating because he was talking about um, how kids nowadays, and I think this started with the millennial society. I think that we've seen in the last 25 years a lot of that process that has to do with the feeling of entitlement to have,
Mm.
right? I mean, even these kids that have been privileged, you know, and have gotten everything they wanted in life, now they feel they're entitled to that what was given to them. And I think that that's the biggest problem with the process of helicopter parenting, is that the kid becomes entitled, but he never learns to earn it,
Mm.
right? Um, so if we want our kids to be healthy and not entitled, you know, I mean, let me give you a paradox. We have all these kids nowadays, right, that they feel entitled to riot, right? They feel entitled to go into a store, you know, and take things that don't belong to them, basically steal them and take them because they're entitled to have it. And I'm not talking kids that have need. I'm talking just kids middle class and higher, right? And then you talk to them and they tell you, well, uh, I deserve it, you know, I'm entitled to have it. So when we talk about values and we talk about rules, that's what I'm talking about. We having a whole new generation that seems to be enamored with socialistic rule, right? When they grew up to be entitled because of capitalistic processes.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Now, talk about a paradox. It really is.
Yeah. So, and I'm not talking about one or the other system. I mean, obviously, I don't like socialism. I have lived under socialism. I know what it's like. So, these kind of idealism of people who haven't been entitled to get whatever they want, and now they want to change the political system because uh, they want to get rid of what made them entitled. Is a huge paradox. You know, we're seeing a lot of that. But you know, I think it's also important to remember that parents also have a lot of influence,
Mm.
especially in the early ages of development, on how the kids are going to be handling things, right? But again, it's important to remind parents that we as parents don't have the ability to change our kids, but we have the ability to provide them with tools, you know, and we have to avoid hostility, because what happens, if you really think about it, when we become hostile to the child is in control of us.
Mm.
So why do we want to give up our power and control, right? But it takes a lot of practice, and you don't go to school for that. right? It's not something you're going to learn in any school. So it's not unusual that we will lose it, right? We will lose control. We'll get angry. We'll get frustrated. We raise our voice. And that's in the best of circumstances. In the worst of circumstances, you get into domestic violence and kids being kicked out of the house and child protective services being involved. And I deal with that all the time. But the reality is that we as parents need to learn to self-regulate. We have to be able to recognize I'm getting out of control. I need to take a step back. And if I'm not able to, I need to go and learn how to do it. Not because you need therapy or because you're crazy or you're psychotic, just because you want to learn, just like you want to learn to play golf, you want to learn to shoot or you want to learn whatever hobby you want. Why don't you try to learn how to be a parent if you're having trouble with it, right? I mean, we need to master the ability of parenting the more we can. And we have to be able to recognize our own shortcomings, right? We have a lot of one parent households here, I mean, in the United States and in the rest of the world. And we have to recognize that that becomes a little more difficult, right? And you have to be able to take a step back and say, well, maybe I need to take some courses on how to, not why, because people tend to get engaged a lot into how come I'm so bad of a parent. There's no bad parents. I mean, take that back. I've seen a very few bad parents, ill intentioned
Mhm.
parents who want to hurt the kids. But in general, I would say 99% of parents have a good intention. They want the best for their kids, but they don't know how to.
It's interesting. You hear people say, well, my kid did not come with instructions, right? Or a
Mhm.
manual. But guess what? Neither did being a parent, right? And so, where would somebody find that training?
There are places where they do parent training. You can talk to your pediatrician when they're little. Say, can you refer me to someone, who can help me learn how to not get frustrated, how to not get angry. You don't have to go to a psychiatrist to do that. But I mean, nowadays, you just like have to Google parenting instructions, and parenting classes and things of that sort. And I think that parents should be taught that during the pregnancy, right? I think that we do a very good job on training them for the biological stuff,
Mm,
how to feed your kid, this during the delivery, this is going to happen. But I think that we need to do some more work on the attachment issues, right? How vulnerable your kids are in the first couple of years of life, how to recognize certain things, and how do we start the process of including the kid on the responsibility taking process of the household, you know, because once the kids get to be teenagers, you have very limited options. Your options become don't get upset, start doing some things that are different, include the kid in your life, you know learn how to be somewhat of your friend's support and somewhat of your child's support and somewhat of your child's friend, right? But you have to be able to establish rules and consequences that are enforceable. It is extremely important to not try to change all behaviors at once, right?
mm,
You have to pick the behavior that is most problematic and you start working with that. If you're not able to do it through some basic behavior modification, get to see a therapist, but go with an open mind, right? I find parents very defensive when I see them with a child in crisis. And to some degree, they're consciously or unconsciously asking, what did I do wrong?
mm.
That is the worst question a parent should ever ask, because you're assuming that what is happening to your child is your fault. Okay. Go with an open mind, with the idea that, you know, I've done the best I could with what I knew, and I know I've made some mistakes, but sometimes I have to tell parents, listen, if you had planned for this to happen by neglecting your kids in this and this and this and that way, probably would have never happened,
Hmm. Interesting.
right? But as a parent, it's difficult. It's very difficult to see your kids hurting, and it's your natural response to try to protect them. So that balance between protecting your child and allowing them independence during adolescence becomes a challenge for some parents, especially nowadays when you have cultural issues and you have gender issues and you have a lot of things that challenge the parents from a different perspective, and that's um, for a different talk. But all of those details are important, right? And it doesn't matter how much the kid challenging you, doesn't matter how much the kid's pushing your buttons, doesn't matter how angry you're getting, don't lose control.
Number one piece of advice.
Exactly.
All right. And once again, I appreciate Doctor talking to us and sharing some of your knowledge and appreciation. Again, everybody listening, please like, share, and subscribe. If there's any topic that you're in particular wanting to hear about, please leave comments. If not, here on the live channel, on the notes of the YouTube channel, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Hey, thank you very much. We'll see you next week, same time. You take
Take
care.
take care.